In 2001, tech insiders were whispering about a secret invention that would force every city on Earth to redesign itself. Venture capitalists who had seen the prototype went quiet in a way that only fueled the rumors further. Whisper networks in Silicon Valley are usually wrong, but this one felt different because the whispers were coming from people who did not normally get excited about anything. Steve Jobs reportedly said that city planning itself would change around this device, that architects would eventually design buildings differently just to accommodate it. Think about how enormous that claim actually is. Jobs was already the most famous product visionary alive, and he was suggesting that a single gadget could reshape concrete, sidewalks, and skylines. That is not a compliment you casually hand out. That is the kind of statement that turns a product launch into a cultural event before a single unit ships. The device turned out to be the Segway, a self-balancing two-wheeled scooter. When it was finally unveiled, the reaction from most ordinary people watching the broadcast was somewhere between confusion and a shrug. Where was the city reshaping technology? What people got instead was a scooter. A clever, genuinely impressive feat of engineering, but a scooter. The inventor behind it predicted selling 10,000 units a week within the first year on the market. Sit with that number for a second, because it is the number that makes this whole story worth telling. 10,000 units a week is not a modest, cautious, under-promise and over-deliver kind of forecast. It is the forecast of someone who is completely convinced they are holding the next bicycle, the next automobile, a category-defining leap in how human beings move through space. Reality landed nowhere close to that wild early prediction. In its first decade on the market, the Segway sold roughly 30,000 units total. Read those two numbers side by side again. 10,000 units a week was the target. 30,000 units in 10 years was the actual result. That means the company's entire decade of total sales amounted to a fraction of a single week's original projected sales target. Not a fraction of a year, a fraction of 1 week. Consider what 10,000 units a week actually implies about the mindset inside that company. A forecast that aggressive is not built from customer surveys, pilot programs, or careful regional rollouts. It is built from watching a room full of the most sophisticated technologists on the planet lean forward in genuine astonishment. When people who have seen everything react like they have never seen anything like this before, it is tempting to conclude the whole world will react the same way. That conclusion feels rational in the moment. It almost never survives contact with an actual retail shelf. So, what actually went wrong behind all that early hype and all that expensive secrecy? This is the part that matters far more than the scooter itself, because the answer is not really about wheels or gyroscopes. The company built the entire product around insider excitement, not around customer research. Engineers, investors, and a small circle of famous early viewers were dazzled by the underlying technology. Nobody with real authority inside that process seriously tested whether ordinary people, the ones who would actually need to buy the thing with their own money, wanted a $900 scooter sitting in their garage. $900 was a serious sum of money for a personal transportation device that solved a problem most people did not feel they had. Cars solved a clear problem. Bicycles solved a clear problem. The Segway solved a problem that mostly existed in the minds of the people building it, which is a very different thing from a problem the market is actively feeling and actively willing to pay to fix. Then there is the physical world, which does not care how impressive your engineering is. Sidewalks were not designed for it. Most sidewalks in most cities are narrow, cluttered with pedestrians, mailboxes, uneven pavement, curbs, and street furniture, built for feet, not for a self-balancing platform moving at a meaningfully faster pace than walking. Laws in many cities restricted where the device could even legally operate, which meant that in some places you could not ride it on the sidewalk, and you also could not ride it on the road with cars. That leaves a rider with almost nowhere legal to actually use the product they just paid $900 for. Picture the actual experience of an early buyer. You unbox this remarkable piece of engineering, you step on, you feel the genuinely impressive self-balancing technology do its job, and then you go outside and discover there is nowhere you are allowed to ride it. That gap between the experience the engineers designed for and the environment the product actually had to survive in is the entire story in miniature. Think about what that gap actually costs a company, not just in unsold units, but in the shape of the entire organization built around a wrong assumption. Factories get sized for 10,000 units a week. Supply chains get negotiated for that volume. Sales and support teams get hired to handle that scale of customer contact. Every one of those decisions gets made months before a single, ordinary customer has told the company anything real about price, sidewalks, or local law. By the time the actual demand numbers arrive, the organization has already built itself around the fantasy version of the market instead of the real one. And unwinding that is far more expensive and far more painful than building it correctly the first time would have been. The secrecy that generated all that early buzz also meant no real market feedback loop ever existed. This is worth sitting with, because secrecy and hype are not free. They come at a direct cost, and the cost is information. Every day the project stayed locked behind non-disclosure agreements and guarded prototypes was a day nobody could walk up to a real potential customer, hand them the device, and simply watch what happened. Would they use it daily? Would they pay $900 for it? Would they know where they were legally allowed to ride it? Those questions never got asked at scale until after the big reveal, when the answers were already extremely expensive to fix. Engineers polish the technology while pricing, regulation, and actual customer behavior sat almost entirely unexamined. That is a very specific and very common failure mode, and it deserves a name. Call it the workshop trap. Inside a workshop, every improvement feels like progress, because you are comparing today's prototype to yesterday's prototype. The balance gets smoother, the turning radius gets tighter, the battery lasts a little longer. Every single one of those improvements is real, and every single one of them is measured against the wrong baseline. The right baseline was never yesterday's prototype. The right baseline was always the sidewalk, the price tag, and the law. This pattern repeats constantly inside companies chasing a big breakthrough product launch. And here is the part nobody expects when they first hear this story. The technology almost never gets blamed, and it almost never should be. The Segway's underlying self-balancing system was a real, respected engineering achievement, one that other products and industries quietly borrowed from for years afterward. The failure was not in the gyroscopes. The failure was in the assumption that impressive engineering automatically creates market demand. Impressive engineering, hidden behind secrecy, unchecked by real customers before a big reveal, is a pattern you can find across decades of product launches, in categories as different as consumer electronics, food and beverage, and enterprise software. Plenty of famously secretive products, unveiled with enormous fanfare after years behind closed doors, have gone on to struggle badly once outsiders finally got to touch them. The specific products vary from decade to decade. The mechanism behind the failure is identical every single time. A small group of insiders convinces itself that its own excitement is a reliable proxy for the market's excitement, and it almost never is. It is worth being precise about why insider excitement fails as a proxy, because the failure is not about insiders being unintelligent or careless. Insiders are usually the most technically capable people in the entire process. Their excitement is genuine and well-earned, given what they know. The problem is what they know versus what a customer knows. An insider evaluates a product against the previous prototype, against the technical problem they personally struggled to solve, against the sheer novelty of watching something work that has never worked before. A customer evaluates the exact same product against a completely different question. Does this solve a problem I already have, at a price I am already willing to pay, in a way that fits inside the rules and physical realities I already live under? Those are not the same question, and a team that only ever answers the first one can walk straight into a launch fully convinced they have already answered the second. This is also why the size of the reveal often works against the product instead of for it. A quiet, modest launch invites modest, honest feedback. A launch preceded by claims that city planning itself will change invites a different kind of scrutiny, one where the product has to be judged not against its own merits, but against the scale of the promise that preceded it. A merely good scooter, introduced quietly, might have found a real niche market among warehouse workers, tour guides, and police patrols, all of which it eventually did find, years later, once expectations reset. The same scooter, introduced as a device Steve Jobs reportedly said would redesign cities, was almost guaranteed to disappoint, because no ordinary consumer product could have lived up to that framing. Over-promising does not just risk missing a target, it resets the entire scale by which the outcome gets judged. There is a reason this particular failure mode is so hard to catch from the inside, and it has less to do with intelligence than with incentives. Nobody inside a secretive, high-status project wants to be the person who asks the deflating question in front of everyone else. Raising your hand in a room full of believers and asking whether ordinary people will actually pay $900 for this, or whether they will be legally allowed to ride it anywhere, is socially expensive in a way that staying quiet is not. So the room keeps nodding, the prototype keeps improving, and the one kind of feedback that could have saved the launch, blunt outside skepticism, never gets invited into the building until it is too late to matter. Here is the original piece of this worth sitting with if you manage people or products for a living. Insider excitement is not just an unreliable signal, it is actively self-reinforcing in a way that makes it feel more reliable the longer it goes unchecked. The more secretive a project is, the smaller the group of people reacting to it, and the smaller that group is, the more likely they are to share the same assumptions, the same blind spots, and the same enthusiasm feeding on itself in a closed room. A boardroom full of people nodding at each other is not evidence of demand. It is evidence that you have successfully convinced a small, self-selected audience that already wanted to be convinced. That audience is the least useful group on earth for telling you whether a $900 scooter belongs on a public sidewalk. Excitement inside a boardroom is not the same thing as market demand outside it, and the distance between those two things is exactly where products like this one go to die. The practical lesson for any manager launching something new is simple to state and uncomfortable to actually practice. Test assumptions with real users early, even when doing so feels like it might puncture the excitement you have worked hard to build, especially when it feels that way. The moment a project becomes too precious to expose to blunt outside feedback is the exact moment it most needs that feedback. Think about how cheaply this could have been tested. A handful of ordinary people, a prototype, a normal city block with normal sidewalks and normal traffic laws, months before the big reveal. Watch where they try to ride it. Ask them what they would actually pay. Notice how quickly the excitement in the room runs into the reality of a curb, a crowded crosswalk, or a police officer who has never heard of this device and does not know whether it belongs on the road or the sidewalk. That single afternoon of honest, unglamorous testing would have surfaced almost every problem that eventually sank the sales numbers at a tiny fraction of the cost of building an entire secretive launch campaign around a device nobody outside the room had ever tried. None of this means secrecy itself is the villain. Plenty of successful products are developed under real confidentiality, for entirely legitimate competitive reasons, and still succeed. The difference is what secrecy is protecting. If secrecy is protecting a genuine competitive edge while the team still quietly gathers honest signal from real potential customers, through private pilots, small trials, or trusted outside testers, it can coexist just fine with market discipline. If secrecy is protecting the room's own excitement from being punctured by outside reality, it stops being a competitive strategy and starts being a shield against the one kind of information the project actually needs. The Segway's secrecy was overwhelmingly the second kind. The buzz it generated was real. The market feedback it generated was close to zero, right up until the moment the product met an actual sidewalk full of actual strangers who owed the company nothing. For a manager, the practical version of this lesson is not never keep secrets. It is never let secrecy become the reason you stopped talking to customers. Those are two very different rules, and it is worryingly easy to follow the second one while telling yourself you are only doing the first. There is also a longer arc to this story that rarely makes it into the retelling, and it is worth knowing because it complicates the easy version of the lesson. The Segway did not simply vanish. Long after the consumer launch failed to hit anything close to its original forecast, the underlying technology found real, durable use in narrower markets, warehouses, tourism, security patrols, and eventually in other mobility products that borrowed its self-balancing approach. That matters for a manager because it shows the failure was specifically a market fit failure, not a technology failure. The lesson is not that ambitious engineering is a trap. The lesson is that ambitious engineering still has to be paired with a boring, unglamorous, early conversation with the exact strangers who will eventually decide whether to hand over $900. Hype, built-in isolation, no matter how confident the room feels, tends to collapse the moment it meets the actual sidewalk, not the metaphorical sidewalk. The literal, physical, regulation-bound, pedestrian-cluttered sidewalk that your actual customer has to navigate with your actual product at your actual price, under your actual local laws. Every one of those constraints was knowable in advance. Every one of those constraints could have been tested with a handful of ordinary people months before the big reveal, at a fraction of the cost of building an entire mystique-driven launch around secrecy. The tragedy of this story is not that the technology failed. The tragedy is that the technology succeeded and the company still failed, because success was defined entirely by what happened inside the workshop instead of what happened outside it. Confidence inside a locked room is cheap. Anyone can generate it. With the right group of people, the right non-disclosure agreements, and enough time spent admiring the same prototype from the same angles. Confidence on an open sidewalk, tested by strangers who owe you nothing and have no reason to be polite about their honest reaction, is the only kind that counts. That is the confidence that 10,000 units a week was supposed to be built on. It never was. 30,000 units in 10 years is what happens when a room full of believers forgets to ask a single stranger walking down the street what they actually think. More real case studies like this follow along.